So we heard from Jay Powell this week, and he said, look, we're looking at something in the 2.5 range and inflation going in the right direction. And labor market's still pretty strong. Growth is pretty strong. It looks like a pretty good economy. Is he right?
I think if we look at the aggregate numbers, aggregates are good. But, Chinese have a central plan, and, they tell us they have a 5.5% GDP target. So GDP looks good, but underneath the hood, there's some alarming things. The last jobs number, 50% of the jobs were created by the government. If we have government adjacent, which is healthcare and education, it was up to about 80%. Inflation is slowly coming down. The shelter number came down this month. And, I don't think the Fed needs to be in a hurry. They had been with this so-called dot plot, which I think they should get rid of because it's becoming an embarrassment for them. They'd been at 3 cuts for 2024. Just at the June meeting, they adjusted to 1 cut. And now the market is pricing in 2 or 3 for the year. So, it's all over the place. So, having been very wrong, why not take your time, make sure, and see what happens.
So let's talk about what you think a second term with Donald Trump might mean for some of those very factors you're talking about, particularly that bottom 50%, the people who really feel that they're hurting right now. What would he do, given this economy, given that it's pretty good from most measurements, what would he do to really make it that much better?
Well, look, I think we're going to have to reprivatize the economy because this is running on government spending. We're at a 7% peacetime, non-recessionary budget deficit. This is unheard of. I have a piece out today saying for the first time, interest costs are exceeding our defense spending. So the spending is now becoming also a national security issue. So I think we are going to go back to under Donald Trump, the private sector pushed the economy. We didn't get inflation because the private sector impetus was met with deregulation. Under the Biden economy, they had big government spend, but it was met by increased regulation. That's the formula for inflation.
There's a lot of talk, as you know, about getting the deficit under control, but President Trump in his first term did not get the deficit under control. I mean, if you look at least the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, they say under his administration, we added $8.4 trillion, and $4.3 trillion of that was not COVID related. We added a lot under Biden as well, but actually substantially less than under President Trump.
Yeah, well, they're using CBO projections, not the actual numbers.
Well, talk about taxes, because that's also a concern in that piece you refer to. Bob Rubin and Ken Chenault, they actually said there's a problem with the tax, extending the tax cuts that we had back in 2017. If you extended that, that would really substantially increase the deficit. Because only, and I think this is a CBO number, you correct me if it's wrong, but only 20% of those tax cuts actually paid for themselves.
Well, I think this time around, and I think with Trump 1.0, we got to stop the clock at the end of 2019 because COVID was a game changer, and I think that there is big appetite for pay-fors this time. So I think we would get this Orwellian named Inflation Reduction Act under control. I think you'd save $1 trillion on that. If you empower states on Medicaid, that's another $1 trillion. I think that there will be some tariff income. So I think that there is a big appetite to reinstate the tax cuts, but with pay-fors.
Well, tariffs, there would be income to the federal government, but the money would come out of consumers' pockets, would it not? I mean, China doesn't pay that money. Consumers pay it, and it might stoke inflation.
Well, look, I think that if you are if we have $40 or $50 oil, and we have deregulation, we have higher growth, we control immigration at the border because this unfettered immigration, now the economics profession had for years said that somehow the one thing that didn't respond to supply and demand was immigrant labor. Now they're saying, oh no, it does suppress inflation, increases economic growth. So I think if we secure the border, the bottom 25% of Americans will see wage increases.
But President Trump is talking about more than securing the border. He certainly has been talking about that for a long time. He's also talking about deporting a lot of people who are not documented here now. Wouldn't that reduce the workforce and therefore increase wage costs and inflation?
Look, it could for the bottom 25%, those people are not working at Microsoft. And not even in middle income jobs. And I don't know about you, I've got no problem if the bottom 25% gets a much deserved wage increase. Under Trump 1.0, working class Americans did better than the top 10 or 20%. In the Joe Biden economy, it's been great. In the Biden economy, you either own assets or you don't. The stock market's at a record high, housing prices are at a record high. Bottom 50% of Americans have debt. Most households couldn't meet a $500 medical emergency. And I think it'd be great if that group got a wage increase.
One last one, another issue raised in that piece in the New York Times you refer to is the independence of the Federal Reserve. And I'm not sure how much we've really heard from President Trump himself about that. We've heard from people like Peter Navarro, who've talked about firing Jay Powell. I'm not sure what his plans are in that. But how important is that? I know you've been concerned, actually, that the current Fed chair has not been as independent as he should have been from President Biden.
Well, look, let's go back to the original sin. The original sin in the independence of the Fed, Jay Powell's reappointment was the latest this century for a Fed chair, latest this century. And I think that is what stoked or certainly accelerated the inflation. At Jackson Hole, August 2021, you go back and read Jay Powell's speech, he knew inflation was hot. Biden administration did not announce his reappointment until November, so they had him under the thumb. Now, he could have been a good patriot and risked his job and started raising rates, but he didn't. So rates didn't get hiked. They didn't start the hiking cycle until March, and he knew inflation was getting hot in August. But back to your question on President Trump. Look, I think he's going to make his opinion known. I think what is happening with this Rubin editorial and what I'm seeing with a plethora, even Larry Summers and 16 Nobel Prize winners who, by the way, 13 of them said that the Biden spending would not be inflationary. 2 of them are dead. So I don't know where the other guy went. One is married to Janet Yellen. So the Biden economy hasn't worked, so they're trying to create the Bogeyman of Trump 2.0, and I don't think people are going to buy it. But to finish with the Fed, President Trump's going to make his opinion known, and my advice to him would be to announce as early as possible, do the opposite of what the Biden administration did, give forward guidance on the new Fed chair.